The Gardener of Lost Lights. Story, voice, and images were generated by artificial intelligence. Music by Ivan Elsesser, originally created for Symbology Cinematics, YouTube. Prologue. Before the lights in Silenda faded, the memory of their meaning faded first. People forgot that a light was more than just a remedy against the dark. A light was an anchor, a beacon for the memory of joy, a silent guardian for hope on long nights. But the city grew tired. Its corners and edges were worn down by a steady gray drizzle that washed not only the bricks, but also the souls of the people, until they had taken on a uniform, resigned color. The great clock in the market square no longer struck the hours. It merely counted the passing time. And with time, the strength in the gas lanterns, in the filaments of the few electric lamps, and finally, in their hearts, also dwindled. It was not a sudden darkness that befell Silenda. It was a slow, quiet extinguishing, a collective exhale, after which no one found the strength to breathe in again. The lights did not go out. They gave up. And so people learned to live in the twilight. They learned to no longer truly recognize their neighbors' faces, to forget the colors of the rare flowers in the pots, and to no longer see the fine cracks in the teacups. Silence became a constant companion, and the darkness an old, heavy blanket under which dreams froze. But even in the deepest, most silent darkness, a whisper sometimes survives. A rumor as delicate as the flutter of a moth's wing. The legend of the Gardener of Lost Lights. Chapter 1. Silenda. The city of Silenda did not dwell in absolute darkness, but in a silent one. Its cobblestone alleys, slick with a perpetual drizzle, were lined with narrow, timber-framed houses that huddled together as if for warmth. Gas lamps cast uncertain, watery circles of light onto the wet stones, their flames flickering weakly, more out of habit than conviction. The few electric bulbs that dotted the main square hummed with a tired, weary glow. It was an era of emerging technology, yet Silenda felt ancient. The problem wasn't a lack of power. The problem was that the lights themselves seemed to have lost their soul. It was as if the lanterns had given up hope, their glow thin and pale, barely strong enough to keep the deepest shadows at bay. The city was a world painted in shades of charcoal and slate, where even the daylight seemed filtered through a veil of gray. And in this quiet gray, a legend survived, passed down in whispers on doorsteps and in hushed tones in the few remaining taverns. It was the legend of the Gardener of Lost Lights. They said that somewhere, hidden within the city's labyrinthine core, there was a garden that no map showed, a place where an old man cultivated not ordinary flowers, but plants that glowed from within. Each blossom, each leaf was said to hold a different kind of light, a different color of a forgotten feeling. They whispered of glimmering leaves that could reignite a faded memory, of blossoms that shone with the warmth of a long-lost embrace. They spoke of the rarest of them all, a light for the memory of joy. For most people in Silenda, it was just that, a story, a bittersweet fairy tale to tell children on nights when the silence grew too loud. But for some, for the ones whose inner light had grown dangerously dim, the whisper of this legend was the last remaining spark in their world. Chapter 2. The Weight of Silence. Elara knew the sound a first heavy raindrop makes when it falls on dry dust. She knew the creak of the old floorboards in her small attic apartment and the distant call of the ships that sometimes cried like ghosts through the fog in the harbor. But the sound she missed the most was the carefree laughter of her little sister Lena. That laughter had fallen silent a year ago, in that cold, gray winter when the illness had simply taken it away, as quietly and relentlessly as the twilight that descended upon Silenda each day. Since then, Elara's world had become a little quieter, a little grayer than that of the others. The light within her hadn't just faded, it had shattered. She worked in a weaving mill on the edge of the harbor district, a large, drafty room filled with the rhythmic clatter of steam-powered looms. The air was heavy with the smell of damp wool and machine oil. Day after day, Elara sat at her loom, pulling the threads through. It was monotonous work that required no thought, and that was precisely what she valued about it. Her hands moved as if on their own, while her mind remained empty, a safe harbor from the waves of memory. That afternoon, as the pale light of the gas lamps outside was already beginning to flicker on, she paused. Her fingers rested on the gray and brown threads. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the color of Lena's favorite dress. Was it sky blue, or more like the deep blue of cornflowers? The image in her mind remained blurry, the color washed out, as if a steady rain had rinsed it from her memory. A pain, sharp and familiar, tightened in her chest. That was what the darkness in Silenda did. It didn't just steal the light from the lamps, it stole the colors from the past. When the bell signaled the end of her shift, Elara pulled her thin coat tighter around herself and stepped out into the damp cold. On her way home, in one of the narrow alleys where the wind seemed to whisper, she heard it. It wasn't a real conversation, more like snippets of words from two old women on a doorstep. "Someone got a twig from him again," murmured one. "A shimmer leaf, I heard, for her boy who wouldn't speak anymore." The other nodded slowly. "The old gardener, some say he's just a fairy tale." "Fairy tales don't keep you warm when it's cold," the first retorted, "but a light does." Elara stood frozen to the spot. The legend. She had heard it countless times, had always dismissed it as a comfort for the hopeless. But today, in this moment, when the color of Lena's dress seemed unattainable, the words clung to her heart. A light for the memory of joy. A thought as quiet and delicate as the first shoot of spring began to sprout within her. What if it wasn't a fairy tale? What if there was a place where the color still shone? Chapter 3. The First Thread. The next morning was no brighter than the day before. A fine drizzle settled like a veil over the slate roofs of Silenda, making the alleys glisten in a dreary gray. But something within Elara was different. The thought of the garden had survived the night, a tiny, warm tea light in the quiet chamber of her heart. She knew it was foolish. To search for a place that existed only in rumors was like trying to grasp fog with her hands. But the alternative, to return to the empty silence of her apartment and watch the last colors of her memories fade away, was unbearable. Her search began where the legends were most alive, in the oldest districts of the city, near the market square, where the sounds and smells were densest. She spoke to the old baker, his hands white with flour dust, and casually asked him about unusual gardens. He only laughed, a hoarse, guttural sound. "Child, nothing grows in this city anymore but moss and sorrow." She asked a flower seller who was offering a few pale asters at the edge of the square. The woman just shrugged. "If such a place existed, I'd probably be out of a job." Each rejection was a small, cold sting that threatened to extinguish her delicate little light. The people of Silenda had learned to lock away their hope, to cast it aside as worthless ballast, to move more easily through their gray daily lives. Discouraged, she leaned against a damp house wall late in the afternoon, watching the bustle. The rain had stopped. a little girl with a much too large woolen scarf chased after a puddle, laughing as the water splashed. The sound struck Elara right in the heart. It was so pure, so untouched by the burden of the city. When the child noticed her, she stopped and looked at her with big, curious eyes. "Why are you sad?" she asked without preamble. Elara was so taken aback that she told the truth. "I'm looking for something. A garden." The girl's eyes lit up. "The one with the glow flowers?" Elara's breath caught. She knelt down to the child. "You know of it?" The girl nodded eagerly. "I saw the flower man yesterday. He had a flower that shone really soft, like the moon when it's not shy." She stretched out her small finger and pointed in a direction away from the market square, towards where the alleys looked even narrower and the houses even older. He went that way into the Weaver's Quarter. The Weaver's Quarter, the oldest and most winding part of Silenda, a labyrinth of brick and timber, of abandoned workshops and drafty warehouses, where it was said that even the locals got lost. Elara watched the child, who was already chasing a new puddle. For the first time in a year, she felt something that was almost like warmth. It wasn't much, just the word of a child, a pointed way into a labyrinth. But it was a thread, the first thread in an otherwise empty weave, and she was ready to follow it. Chapter 4. The Labyrinth of Brick and Silence. The Weaver's Quarter did not welcome Elara with open arms, but with a maze of shadows. The alleys here were so narrow that the timber-framed houses seemed to lean over her head, leaving only a slender strip of the eternally gray sky. The air smelled different, of cold stone, damp wood, and the dusty silence of long-abandoned workshops. Many years ago, this had been the heart of Silenda, the rhythmic clatter of thousands of looms filling the alleys. Now it was just an echo. Elara followed the direction the little girl had pointed out. Her heart beat a little faster, a mix of fear and excited anticipation. Every archway looked like a secret entrance. Every weathered door could have been the gate to the garden. She wandered for a while, nearly losing herself in the tangle of paths that seemed to have grown without plan or purpose. The few people she encountered scurried past with their gazes lowered. It was a place of forgetting, and those who lived here seemed to guard that oblivion. Her hope was already beginning to wane again when she noticed it. Hanging on a rusty iron gate that enclosed a small, overgrown courtyard was something. It was a single leaf, artfully woven from light-colored bast fiber. But that wasn't what was special. From the center of the leaf emanated a gentle, almost imperceptible pulse. Not a light one could see, but one that could be felt. A tiny, subtle warmth that pushed back the damp chill for a moment. Elara reached for it with a trembling hand. As her fingertips touched the bast leaf, it was as if she felt a spark. For a fraction of a second, a color flashed before her inner eye, a clear, brilliant sky blue, the color of Lena's dress. The shock and the sudden wave of memory made her recoil. The blue vanished as quickly as it had come, but it had left an indelible impression. It was real. The legend was real. "Are you looking for something, young woman?" A voice, quiet and creaky like old wood, made her spin around. In the doorway of the adjacent house stood an old man, watching her with tired but vigilant eyes. He was a watchmaker. Through the dusty window pane behind him, she could see the clutter of tiny gears and tools. Elara didn't know what to say. Her gaze fell back to the bast leaf. The old man followed her gaze, and a knowing smile flickered across his lips. "Ah, you're following his signs." He stepped aside and gestured with a nod of his head into his house. "Come in, the cold is not a good counselor." Hesitantly, but drawn by a force stronger than her fear, Elara crossed the threshold, leaving the gray alley behind. She entered a world filled with the quiet, steady ticking of countless clocks. Chapter 5. The Ticking Heart. The inside of the shop was a world unto itself. It was cramped and cluttered, and the air hummed with a sound Elara had almost forgotten, the quiet, steady heartbeat of time. Hundreds of clocks ticked on the walls, on shelves, and on dusty workbenches. Grandfather clocks with solemn faces stood guard in the corners, while tiny, delicate pocket watches gleamed in the light of a single oil lamp. It was a symphony of seconds, a place where every moment was measured and counted. The old watchmaker, whose name she learned was Silas, shuffled behind a counter strewn with the finest instruments. Without asking, he poured her a cup of steaming herbal tea. His movements were slow and precise, much like the hands of the clocks he tended. "You have the eyes of a seeker," he said, his voice a quiet creak amidst the ticking. "Not many have those anymore. Most people here prefer not to look too closely. They're afraid of what they might find, or what they might not find." Elara wrapped her cold hands around the warm cup. The leaf, outside, it felt like a memory. Silas finished her sentence and nodded. "Yes, that is his way. He leaves little anchors for those who are adrift on the sea of time." "Who is he?" Elara whispered the question she had carried with her all day. "The gardener. Is he real?" Silas picked up a tiny golden gear with a pair of tweezers and held it up to the light. "As real as the sorrow in this city, and as the hope that refuses to die." He looked at her, his eyes surprisingly sharp. "But you won't find his garden by asking for an address. It doesn't exist on any map of Silenda." Elara's heart sank. "But how then?" "He once told me," Silas said, his gaze distant. "His garden grows where the city holds its breath." He paused, letting the ticking of the clocks fill the silence. Time in Silenda is a sluggish river, always flowing towards the gray sea. But there are moments and places where it forms eddies, where it hesitates before moving on. He placed the tiny golden gear back on his workbench. "You are looking for a light to heal what is broken. Think, child, where in this city of decay does something new begin? Where does the forgotten get a second chance?" Elara frowned, trying to decipher his words. A place where the city holds its breath? Where the forgotten gets a second chance? It was a riddle, not an answer. She looked around the shop, at the countless clocks, all showing slightly different times, yet all moving relentlessly forward. Silas seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't look at the hands," he advised gently. "Listen to the heartbeat. The answer doesn't lie in the grand avenues, but in the quiet pulse of Silenda." He handed her the small woven bast leaf from the date. "Keep this. It will grow warmer when you are on the right path." Elara left the shop. The symphony of ticking clocks faded behind her, replaced by the familiar silence of the weaver's quarter. The riddle echoed in her mind. Her search had now taken on a new form. It was no longer just a search for a place, but for a moment in which time itself seemed to pause, and where a hidden garden might just have enough space to grow. Chapter 6. Where the city holds its breath. With the watchmaker's riddle in her mind and the cool bast leaf in her pocket, Elara's walk through the alleys felt different. She was no longer just a seeker, she was a solver of riddles. Every corner, every quiet nook of Silenda became a potential clue. Where the city holds its breath. Her first thought led her to the grand abandoned city library, a monumental sandstone building whose doors had been locked for decades. Inside, there was absolute silence, a place where thousands of stories had held their breath. She leaned against the heavy oak door, closed her eyes, and focused on the leaf in her pocket. Nothing. It remained as cold as a pebble. Her second thought was the old cemetery behind St. Griswold's church, a place of eternal silence where time had finally come to a standstill. She wandered among the weathered tombstones, their inscriptions almost erased by the rain. Here, too, only the familiar coldness. She understood. The silence of Silenda was an oppressive blanket, but it wasn't what Silas meant. Holding one's breath was something different. It was a moment of tension, of anticipation, of transition. Frustrated, she sat down on a bench at the edge of the canal that flowed sluggishly and gray through the city. She took out the bast leaf and looked at it. Where the forgotten gets a second chance. That was the second part of the key. It wasn't about the end, but about a new beginning. She thought of the things that were forgotten in Silenda. Broken chairs that were thrown out with the rubbish, torn clothes that became rags, toys with chipped paint. Everything was eventually washed away by the gray tide of time. But then, like a bolt from the blue, a memory from her own childhood surfaced. An image as clear as the sky blue she had seen in the weaver's quarter. She had been walking with Lena, hand in hand, through a secluded alley, and her sister had dropped her favorite wooden doll. Its head had broken off. Elara remembered Lena's heartbreaking sobs, and she remembered where their father, Eric, had taken them. Not home, not to a toy shop. He had taken them to the courtyard of second chances, as the children called it, a quiet, almost hidden courtyard on the edge of the weaver's quarter. It was the place where people brought the broken things they cared about too much to throw away. There, old artisans, a carpenter, a cobbler, a seamstress, worked in quiet concentration. They repaired what was broken. They gave the forgotten a second chance. It was a place with a quiet, creative pulse, a place where one inevitably spoke more softly, where all the city's hustle seemed to hold its breath for a moment, out of respect for the patient work of healing. Elara jumped up, her heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't have to search for the way for long. Her feet seemed to know it on their own. She ran through the alleys, turning corners she hadn't seen in years. With every minute she got closer to the old courtyard, she felt it. A gentle, unmistakable warmth emanating from the bast leaf in her pocket and spreading through her hand. She stopped in front of an inconspicuous ivy-covered archway. Behind it, she could hear the quiet sound of a plane gliding over wood. The leaf in her pocket now felt like a stone warmed by the sun. She was here, wherever here exactly led. With a deep breath, she stepped through the archway. Chapter 7: The Courtyard of Second Chances. When Elara stepped through the archway, it was as if she were entering another world. The constant, fine drizzle of Silenda seemed not to reach here. The air was still and smelled of wood glue, leather, and freshly planed shavings. The courtyard was a small paved square surrounded by the backs of old workshops. It was a place of quiet, dedicated work. In one corner sat an old carpenter fitting a new leg onto a three-legged chair with gentle, deliberate movements. Opposite him, a woman with a silver hairpin in her bun was mending the torn sail of a toy boat. A cobbler was quietly hammering new soles onto a pair of worn-out children's boots. No one seemed to notice Elara. They were islands of concentration in a sea of tranquility. Nothing was thrown away here. Everything that was broken, torn, or forgotten was given the chance to become whole again. It was the beating, healing heart of Silenda that Silas, the watchmaker, had spoken of. Elara walked slowly through the courtyard. The bast leaf in her palm was now so warm that it felt as if she were holding a small living bird. The warmth seemed to guide her, away from the artisans, towards the farthest wall of the courtyard. There, the paved path ended before a high brick wall, completely covered in dead gray ivy. It was a dead end. A feeling of disappointment washed over her. Was this all? Had she been mistaken? But the warmth in her hand grew stronger, more insistent. She held the leaf up. In the pale light of the courtyard, she could now see it clearly. A soft silver-white shimmer emanated from it, a light that seemed meant only for her. She stepped closer to the ivy-covered wall. Her gaze followed the shimmer, and there she discovered it. Hidden among all the dead gray vines, a single thin shoot snaked its way up the wall. It was of a rich, vibrant green, and in its veins the same silver light seemed to pulse as in the leaf in her hand. It was the only living plant in sight. Hesitantly, Elara reached out her free hand and touched the glowing shoot with her fingertips. The moment she touched it, the miracle happened. The dead ivy vines trembled and drew aside, not like plants, but like a heavy velvet curtain gliding open silently. Behind it was not the expected brick wall. Behind it was a narrow passage, bathed in a soft, misty light that seemed to come from no lamp and no sun. The path smelled of damp earth, of moss, and of something else, something sweet and hopeful that she could not name. The bast leaf in her hand went dark and grew cool again. Its task was done. It had led her home. With a heart that floated between fear and boundless joy, Elara took the first step out of the gray courtyard of Silenda and into the gentle light of the hidden path. Chapter 8. The Garden That Grows in Silence. The narrow passage was not made of stone. It felt like a path of condensed mist and gentle light. With every step Elara took, the gray heaviness of Silenda fell away from her. The air grew warmer, purer, and smelled of damp living earth. The ticking of the clocks, the clatter of the looms, the distant call of the ships, all the sounds of the city faded behind her, giving way to a deep, peaceful silence. When she stepped out into the open at the end of the path, a soft, incredulous sound escaped her lips. She stood at the edge of a place that could not be of this world. A small garden, enclosed by ancient walls, bathed in a sea of gentle light and color. No ordinary plants grew here. Flowers whose calyxes shone like little white moons swayed on thin stems. Grasses whose tips scattered a shower of golden dust with the slightest breeze lined the winding paths. Ferns unrolled their leaves in a deep, pulsating emerald green, and small ground-covering mosses formed a carpet of countless sapphire blue dots. It was not silent here. A quiet, constant humming filled the air, as if the plants themselves were singing a melody of light. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated joy of life. And in the midst of this luminous splendor, he stood. An old man who matched the image from the legends and yet surpassed it. He wore a simple linen shirt and coarse trousers held up by suspenders. An old straw hat set on his snow-white hair. His face was a land map of kind wrinkles, framed by a neat white beard. He was kneeling by a flower bed, loosening the soil with his bare hands, which looked as if they were made from the earth itself, around a perennial whose heart-shaped leaves glowed in a warm, sunny yellow. As Elara approached, he looked up as if he had sensed her presence long ago. He had the clearest, deepest eyes she had ever seen. They were full of peace and an infinite understanding. He was not surprised. He simply smiled, a gentle, warm smile that erased all fear within her. "Welcome, child," he said, and his voice sounded like the rustling of dry leaves in an autumn wind. "I've been waiting for you." Tears welled up in Elara's eyes, tears of exhaustion, of relief, and of indescribable wonder. All the doubts, all the cold, gray days of her search fell away from her. It's real," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The gardener slowly stood up and brushed the earth from his hands. He walked towards her, his steps quiet on the moss-covered path. "The garden is as real as the pain that led you here." He glanced at her trembling, empty hands. "Everyone who finds their way here has lost a color. Which one is it for you?" The question was so direct and yet so gentle that it opened Elara's heart. "Blue," she breathed, and the sob shook her. "Sky blue, my sister's dress. I can't see it anymore. The memory is faded." The gardener nodded slowly, as if he had heard this answer countless times before. Without another word, he gently took her hand and led her to a flower bed in the center of the garden. There, small, star-shaped flowers bloomed, shining in that exact, unforgettable, clear sky blue she had so desperately sought. Their light was so pure that it hurt and healed at the same time. "These lights do not replace what is lost, Elara," the gardener explained quietly. "They cannot bring back the past, but they can help you remember. Not just the image or the color, but the warmth you felt when it was still there." Carefully, he plucked one of the sky blue starflowers and handed it to her. "A light for the memory of joy." Chapter 9. A New Seed. Elara held the small sky blue flower in her hands. Its light was not harsh or hot, but cool and gentle, like moonlight on fresh snow. It pulsed with the rhythm of a calm heartbeat, and with each pulse, the image in her mind grew clearer. She didn't just see the dress, she saw Lena's face, beaming with joy as she wore it for the first time. She didn't just hear the laughter, she felt it. A warm tingling in her own chest, a long-forgotten joy that returned for a precious moment. The tears that now streamed down her cheeks were no longer the bitter tears of loss, but sweet tears of remembrance. She looked up from the glowing blue in her hand to the countless other lights growing in the garden. The sunny yellow, the hopeful green, the silent white glow. Each of them, she now knew, was an anchor for a lost joy, a remedy for another faded heart in Silenda. In that moment, she understood. This garden was not just the answer to her pain. It was the answer to the pain of the entire city. And a single light, as beautiful as it was, could not penetrate the oppressive blanket of darkness that lay over Silenda. But an entire garden just might. She looked at the gardener, who was watching her with a patient, knowing gaze. The decision ripened within her, as quickly and surely as a plant turning towards the sun. Her journey did not end here. It was just beginning. She began, her voice still fragile, but filled with a new resolve. "I don't want this to be the only light that returns to Silenda." She took a step towards him, holding the glowing flower before her like an offering. "I have seen how the silence crushes people, how it washes the colors from their lives until only gray remains. I don't want to just go home with my memory. I want to help." She took a deep breath and asked the question that would change her entire life. "Please, teach me, show me how to care for these lights, how to make them grow. I don't just want a flower. I want to learn how to plant a garden. I want to be your apprentice." The gardener smiled, and it was as if the wrinkles around his eyes themselves began to glow a little brighter. He took her free hand and enclosed it in his own earthy, warm fingers. "A gardener doesn't just plant seeds in the earth, my child," he said gently. He plants them in the hearts of people. That is the true work. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze going deeper than her eyes, straight into her soul. It is a path that requires more patience than waiting for spring, and more strength than tilling a stony field. Are you ready for it? Yes, Elara answered without the slightest hesitation. The grief for Lena was still there, a quiet ache that would probably always accompany her. But it was no longer the only thing. A new seed had sprouted within her, the seed of a purpose. The gardener nodded slowly. Good, then your apprenticeship begins not tomorrow, but now. Your first lesson is simple. No light can grow in secret. Go, take this flower and return to Silenda. Carry it openly in your hand and do not be afraid of the darkness. Show the people that the colors are not lost forever. He released her hand. And when you are ready for the second lesson, he added, the path will lead you here again. Chapter 10. The Carried Light. The step back through the hidden passage was like plunging into a cold, gray sea. The warmth of the garden gave way to the damp chill of the courtyard of second chances. The humming of the light plants faded, replaced by the familiar, heavy silence of Silenda. The ivy curtain closed silently behind Elara, and for a terrifying moment, she feared she had dreamed it all. But then she looked down at her hand. The sky-blue starflower continued to shine steadfastly, a small piece of the heavens in her palm. Its light painted soft blue shadows on the damp cobblestones. It was real. Her mission was real. Carry it openly and do not be afraid. Her heart pounded as she left the courtyard and stepped back into the alleys of the weaver's quarter. It was one thing to believe in miracles alone in the garden. It was another thing entirely to carry that miracle into a world that had forgotten how to believe. The first glances were curious. A child crouching in a doorway widened his eyes and nudged his father. The man wordlessly pulled the child inside and closed the door. Then came the whispers. Like wildfire, the news of the girl with the glowing thing in her hand seemed to spread. People emerged from their homes but kept their distance. Their faces showed not delight, but suspicion, almost fear. Elara felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Her hand trembled, and she had the instinctive urge to hide the flower in her coat pocket, to protect it from the wary gazes. But then she remembered the feeling when the color of Lena's dress had returned to her memory. She remembered the gardener's task. She took a deep breath, lifted her head a little higher, and forced her pace to calm. She was not a ghost flitting through the alleys. She was a messenger. When she reached the market square, the daily murmur fell silent for a moment. All eyes turned to her. She saw the baker who had laughed at her the day before. His mouth was open, flour dust clinging to her cheek. She saw the flower seller, whose own pale asters looked like gray shadows compared to the pure blue light in Elara's hand. The woman's cynical expression was gone, replaced by incredulous awe. No one spoke to her. No one came closer. But they looked. Elara continued on, across the square, through streets she walked every day, but which felt foreign and endlessly long today. She walked all the way to her small attic apartment without stopping once. When she finally closed the door behind her, she was trembling all over. She leaned against the wood and closed her eyes. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Carefully, she placed the glowing flower in a glass of water and set it on the small table beside her bed. The soft sky blue light filled the room. It danced on the cracked walls, chased the deepest shadows from the corners, and reflected in her tear-reddened eyes. For the first time in a year, the small room no longer felt cold and empty. It no longer felt like just a place where she slept. It felt a little like home again. She had understood the first lesson. It wasn't about changing the world in one fell swoop. It was about lighting a single small light and simply letting it be. A silent promise that the darkness did not have the final word. Chapter 11. The First Crack in the Silence. The days that followed were outwardly unchanged. The sky over Silenda remained a cloth of endless gray, and the fine rain fell with the same tired persistence. But for Elara, everything was different. She no longer woke up in complete darkness. The first thing she saw every morning was the gentle sky-blue glow of the starflower on her nightstand. Its light was a silent greeting, a soft reminder that the garden had not been a dream. It changed her routine. She no longer ate her meager breakfast in a hurry, but would sit at the table for a moment, watching how the light traced the patterns on her teacup. When she went to work, she left the flower behind, but the knowledge of its existence was like a warm stone in her pocket, a secret she carried through the day. At the weaving mill, the clatter of the machines was just as loud, the threads just as gray, but there was a new carefulness in Elara's movements. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could see the blue for a moment, a luminous interruption in the monotony. For 3 days, nothing happened. People on the street still cast glances at her, a mixture of curiosity and shyness, but no one spoke to her. The door to her attic apartment remained closed. On the evening of the 4th day, however, as she was warming a thin soup over the fire, there was a quiet knock. It was such a hesitant knock that she almost mistook it for the sound of the rain. With an uneasy feeling, she opened the door. Standing before her was the flower seller from the market square, a stern woman named Jet, her face weathered by the elements and disappointment. She held a small bunch of the palest asters in her hand, as if it were a shield. Jet began, looking down at her own feet in embarrassment. People are talking. They say you have a light. Elara said nothing. She simply stepped aside, leaving the view into her room clear. The blue glow of the flower spilled through the open door, casting a gentle shimmer on Jet's weary face. A soft sigh escaped the flower seller. She didn't look at the flower, but at the light it cast upon the wall. My husband, before he passed, he always said my eyes were the color of heather in the summer. Violet. I've forgotten what that looks like. She now looked directly at Elara, and in her eyes was not curiosity, but a deep, hidden pain. Is it true? Does it help you remember? Elara thought of the gardener's words. She had no answers, only her own experience. I don't know, she said honestly, but you can come in and just sit in its light for a while if you like. Jet hesitated for only a moment, then she crossed the threshold. She sat down on the only chair at the table, set her useless asters aside, and did nothing but gaze into the blue glow. Elara sat opposite her, and together they sat in a silence that this time was not empty, but filled with the gentle blue pulse. After a long time, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps an hour, Jet closed her eyes. A single tear escaped from the corner of her eye. Violet, she whispered, barely audible. Such a deep, warm violet. When she left the asters on the table. She said no word of thanks, but Elara saw it in her eyes. A tiny crack had appeared in the gray facade. A spark had leaped across. The light had begun its work. Chapter 12. The Color of the Dandelion Meadow. The story of Jet's rediscovered memory did not spread like a wildfire through Silenda, but like a rising mist, quietly, relentlessly, and carried from door to door by the whispers of those who longed for a miracle. This whisper eventually reached the house of the Weber family, at the end of a quiet alley where the shadows hung particularly deep. In this house lived Mara and her 2 children, 14-year-old Leah and 8-year-old Theo. Their home had once been filled with the laughter of their husband and father, Eric, a carpenter whose hands could create something beautiful from any piece of wood. But a long, consuming illness had taken him from them, had slowly erased him until only an oppressive silence remained. Since Eric's death 6 months ago, darkness had moved into their house. It was not a darkness of the night, but one of the heart. Mara, exhausted from months of caregiving and relentless pain, did only what had to be done. Leah had stopped drawing, and little Theo, who used to tear through the house like a whirlwind, now mostly played quietly in a corner of his room. They were a family that consisted only of the outlines of what they once had been. One evening, it was Theo who came in from playing in the street with wide eyes. "Mother," he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper, "the other children say there's a girl with a star flower. They say the flower can bring back the lost colors." Mara, who had been staring listlessly out the window, turned slowly. A bitter pain tightened within her. "Those are just tales, Theo. You know such things don't exist." Hope, she had learned, was a cruel thing when disappointed. But Leah, who was sitting at the table leafing through one of her father's old books, looked up. In her eyes, so similar to her mother's, there was a spark Mara hadn't seen in months. "What if it is true?" she asked quietly. "What do we have to lose?" That evening, driven by her daughter's quiet plea and her son's hopeful gaze, Mara did something she never thought possible. They left their silent house and walked through the dim streets to the address the whispers had given them. When Elara opened the door, she saw the 3 figures standing in the hallway light, a broken line of a mother and her children. Mara's face was a mask of pride and desperation. "They say you have a light," Mara said, her voice rough. "My husband, he loved the summer. When he came home from work, he always brought me a bouquet of dandelions. He said their color was like pure sunlight. I can't remember it anymore. For me, everything is just gray." Elara understood. She understood the pain of losing a color tied to a loved one. Without a word, she stepped back and let the family into her small blue light room. The 3 of them sat awkwardly on the edge of Elara's bed. They stared at the glowing flower in the glass of water. Its gentle sky blue light fell upon their faces, seeming to soften the hard lines of grief. For a long time, they just sat there. Then Theo laid his head in his mother's lap. Leah scooted closer to her and took her hand. And Mara, the strong, unyielding Mara, closed her eyes. Before her inner eye, it happened. At first, it was just a spark. Then slowly, the memory unfolded. A meadow bathed in the warm light of a late afternoon. And all around her, the brightest, most vibrant, most hopeful yellow she had ever seen. The yellow of thousands of dandelions. She saw Eric's laughing face as he held out a particularly large bouquet to her, small yellow petals in his hair. She felt the warmth of the sun on her skin. A tear rolled down her cheek, then another, but this time it was not a tear of emptiness. It was a tear of fullness. When she opened her eyes again, she looked into the faces of her children, and she saw that they had felt it too. In Theo's eyes, there was an old glimmer of childish wonder, and Leah's lips had formed a delicate, almost forgotten smile. That evening, the Weber family did not return to a silent house. They returned to a house where a memory was glowing again. The darkness was still there, but it no longer held absolute power. A small golden light had begun to illuminate it from within. Chapter 13: The Forgotten Green. The darkness inside Jonas had no name and no shape. It was simply there, a silent, gray void that had spread within him in the years after the Great Fight. On the outside, his life had followed an orderly path. He had become a respected bookbinder. His hands were skilled and his work was precise. But in the quiet hours, when the scent of old paper and glue hung in his workshop, he felt it, a coldness where there had once been warmth. He often thought of Leo. He could see him as they sat as boys on the bank of the cliffside stream, their feet in the ice-cold water. He remembered the carefree laughter, the shared secrets, the unshakable feeling that their friendship would last forever. And then came the image of the fight. A stupid, unnecessary argument over a borrowed fishing rod, which, fueled by youthful pride, had become an insurmountable chasm. Neither had backed down, and so they had drifted apart, lost sight of each other. Jonas had tried to bury the memory of their friendship, but it was like a ghost that could find no rest. He could recall every detail of their adventures, but one thing had been lost: the color. The vibrant, almost magical moss green of the stones in the cliffside stream, where the sunlight fell through the leaves of the willows. Whenever he tried to picture that color, all he saw was a dull, lifeless gray. The rumors of the girl with the starflower had reached him too. He had dismissed them as fantasies, as comfort for the weak. But one day, when he met old Silas the watchmaker on the street and saw a gentle, contented smile on his otherwise serious face, he paused. "You seem to be having a good day, Master Silas," Jonas said. Silas nodded slowly. "Every day is a good day when you can recall a beautiful time, my boy." He winked at Jonas. "Sometimes all you need is a little light to find the way back." Those words stuck with Jonas. What if it wasn't a fantasy? What if there was a way to break through this all-consuming gray? That evening, almost against his will, he found himself in the alley where Elara lived. His heart hammered against his ribs. He felt like a fool. When the door opened and he looked into the face of the young woman, illuminated by a soft blue light, he could barely get a word out. He stammered, "I've lost a color, the green of a stream bed in summer." Elara invited him in with a silent nod. Jonas sat on the chair that Jet and the Weber family had occupied before him. He looked at the starflower and let its light wash over him. He expected nothing, but then it happened. The blue seemed to push open a locked door in his heart. Suddenly, he was there again, on the bank of the cliffside stream. He didn't just see the green, he felt it. He felt the coolness of the water on his feet, smelled the damp moss, and heard Leo's laughter beside him, as clear and distinct as if it were yesterday. He saw the stupid broken fishing rod lying on the ground, and no longer felt the anger of that day, but only a deep, infinite sadness for the lost years. He left Elara's apartment in a daze, the rediscovered warmth of the memory in his chest. He walked down the stairs and stepped out onto the street. And there, on the other side of the alley, in the faint glow of a gas lamp, stood a man. He was looking uncertainly at the entrance to Elara's building, his face marked by a familiar turmoil. It was Leo. Their eyes met. Years of silence, of pride, and of pain lay between them. But in that moment, in the lingering glow of a small blue flower, they no longer mattered. There was only recognition, a beginning. Chapter 14. The Bridge of Moss Green. Years of silence can build a wall thicker than any stone. Between Jonas and Leo in the dim alley stood such a wall, built of wounded pride, unspoken words, and the slowly creeping cold of estrangement. They looked at each other, and each saw in the other's face not only the boy from the cliffside stream, but also the stranger he had become. It was Leo who took the first step. Slowly, hesitantly, as if treading on fragile ice, he crossed the street. He stopped in front of Jonas, his hands awkwardly buried in the pockets of his jacket. "You too?" Leo asked, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't used it in a long time. Jonas didn't need to ask what he meant. He just nodded. "The moss green," Jonas said quietly. "I had forgotten it." A smile that looked almost painful flickered across Leo's lips. "Me too." He glanced up at the attic window, from which a faint blue shimmer emanated. "I thought I was the only one foolish enough to believe in fairy tales." "Maybe we are," Jonas replied, but it helped. No more words were necessary. In that brief, awkward exchange lay the apology they had never given each other and the forgiveness they had both longed for. The wall between them hadn't disappeared, but the rediscovered green of their shared memory was like moss that began to grow over the cold stones, building a first, delicate bridge. They did not part that evening as the inseparable friends they once were, but they were no longer strangers either. They parted as two men who had found their way back to each other. This encounter changed something in Silenda. The Weber family's story had been a miracle told in hushed tones, a light for a private home. But the reconciliation of Jonas and Leo was a public event. People saw them in the market the next day, talking to each other for the first time in years. They saw how the tension in their shoulders eased, replaced by an old, familiar camaraderie. The light of the starflower didn't just heal the wounds of grief, it also healed the cracks that life had etched into the fabric of the community. Now, people no longer came to Elara alone, they came in pairs. An old woman who hadn't looked at her sister since a fight over an inheritance. Two businessmen whose partnership had crumbled under mistrust. They didn't always come to find a lost color. They came to find a lost feeling, trust, affection, understanding. Elara understood her role better now. She was not the healer, neither was the little blue flower. They were merely the spark. The light of the starflower was like a fireplace on a cold winter's night. It didn't force anyone to reconcile, but it created a warm, safe space where hearts could thaw and turn towards each other again. Every evening now, people sat in her small room, sometimes in silence, sometimes quietly crying. Sometimes, very rarely, one could even hear a soft, liberated laugh. Elara's room became a small island of light and warmth in the cold gray sea of Silenda. But she knew it wasn't enough. A single flower, as powerful as it was, could not heal everyone. The city needed more. It didn't just need a spark, it needed an entire field of lights. One evening, after the last visitors had left, she looked at the steadfastly glowing flower. She felt a deep gratitude, but also a new, urgent impatience. She had learned the gardener's first lesson. Now she was ready for the second. Chapter 15. The Second Lesson. The next morning, as the first pale dawn filtered through her window, mingling with the blue of the starflower, Elara knew it was time. She had shared the warmth of the light, had seen it create cracks in the silence and make old walls tremble. But she also felt the growing demand, how hope, once awakened, craved more. A single light was a promise, an entire garden was its fulfillment. With a new, quiet determination, she left her apartment. She did not go to the weaving mill. Her hands were no longer meant for the gray threads. She walked the familiar path back to the courtyard of Second Chances. The courtyard greeted her with the same quiet industriousness as before. The carpenter, the seamstress, the cobbler, they all worked patiently on the broken treasures of Silenda. As Elara walked past them, they briefly looked up. In their eyes was no longer suspicion, but a quiet, respectful greeting. They knew who she was. She was the girl who had brought back a light. She stood before the ivy wall at the end of the courtyard. This time, she did not have to search. The single, living green shoot seemed to call to her. She placed her hand on it, and as before, the curtain of dead leaves slid aside, revealing the glowing, misty path. When she entered the garden, it felt like coming home. The gentle humming of the light plants enveloped her, and the scent of damp earth and hope filled her lungs. The gardener was already waiting for her. He was not sitting on the ground, but on a simple wooden bench, and seemed to have been expecting her. Next to him on the bench lay a small, empty clay pot. "I see the first lesson has borne fruit," he said, without looking at her directly. His gaze rested on his earthy hands. "You did not hide the light. You turned it into a fire where others could warm themselves." "But it's not enough," Elara replied, stepping closer. "So many are coming. Their darkness is so vast. My one flower, it's just a drop." "A single drop begins the rain that makes a whole field bloom," the gardener said wisely. He now looked up, and his clear eyes studied her. "You are ready for the second lesson. You have learned to carry a light. Now you must learn to plant a light." He reached into the pocket of his waistcoat and pulled something out. He placed it in his open palm and showed it to Elara. It was a single, unremarkable seed. It was small, gray, and smooth, and looked like an ordinary pebble. Nothing about it hinted at the miracle that slumbered within. "Every light in the garden begins like this," the gardener explained, "as a promise, as a possibility." He handed her the seed. When Elara took it, it felt cool and lifeless. "What must I do?" she asked. "You must give it what it needs to grow, and that is not just soil and water." He tapped the small clay pot beside him. "Take this pot, fill it with the best soil you can find, but the most important part comes after. A light seed does not sprout from the sun. It sprouts from a feeling. Find a place in Silenda that is filled with a specific emotion, a real, deep emotion. Plant the seed there in the soil, and then wait." "What kind of feeling?" Elara asked, confused. The gardener smiled. "The seed will tell you that. Every color, every light needs different nourishment. Some grow from pure joy, others from quiet gratitude, and still others," he paused and his gaze became serious, "grow best in soil that has been nurtured by tears of hope." He stood up. "That is your second lesson, Elara. Find the right place, plant the seed, and learn the most important quality of a gardener: patience." Chapter 16. The Soil of Hope. Elara returned to Silenda with a small clay pot and the unremarkable seed in her pocket. The city seemed even grayer than before, a harsh contrast to the vibrant splendor she had just left. The task weighed heavily on her. Placing a seed in the earth was simple, but finding the right place, the perfect nurturing ground for such a delicate miracle, seemed almost impossible. She wandered through the streets, her gaze no longer searching for paths, but for feelings. She went to the market square, where for fleeting moments loud laughter would erupt when a merchant told a joke. Was this the place? No, it was too superficial. The joy here was like a spark carried away by the wind, not the deep, quiet feeling a seed needed to sprout. She thought of the courtyard of second chances, a place of patient hope, certainly, but the artisans there worked with a quiet, almost resigned acceptance. It was a place of healing, but not of the overwhelming emotion she was looking for. Dejected, she returned to her attic room late in the afternoon. The blue starflower greeted her, a faithful, silent friend. As she sat down on her bed, her gaze fell upon the empty chair at the table, and suddenly she knew. The gardener had spoken of tears of hope. She had seen those tears, not at the market, not in the courtyard. She had seen them on the face of Mara Weber. The memory was as clear as the light of the flower. Mara, sitting with her eyes closed, as a tear of rediscovered memory ran down her cheek. A tear that was not made of pure grief, but of the sweet, painful joy of having a lost color, a lost moment returned. That was it. That was the nurturing ground. The place was not geographical. It was emotional. Without further hesitation, Elara took the pot, the seed, and the still glowing starflower and left her apartment. The path to the Weber family's house now felt right and certain. When Mara opened the door, there was surprise in her eyes. Behind her, Leah and Theo peeked out curiously. "Elara," Mara said, bewildered, "has something happened?" "No," Elara replied, holding up the small clay pot. "But I believe something is about to happen, and I believe it must happen here." She stepped inside and explained the gardener's second lesson to the family. She didn't speak of magic or miracles, but of a seed that needed a very specific feeling to grow. He said that some seeds grow best in soil that has been nurtured by tears of hope, Elara concluded softly. "I saw those tears." Mara looked at her, and a deep understanding was reflected in her eyes. She led Elara to the windowsill of their small living room. It was empty, except for a few dried herbs and a small wooden horse carved by Eric. "Here," Mara said, "this is where he always sat and looked out when he was thinking." Together, they filled the pot with soil from one of the few flower pots on the sill that hadn't completely withered. Leah brought a small watering can. Theo watched with wide, reverent eyes. It was a small, silent ceremony. When the pot was filled, Mara took it in her hands. She looked at the small wooden horse, and her thoughts were with Eric and the dandelion meadow. A single, clear tear detached itself and fell right into the center of the dark earth. In that moment, Elara took the small gray seed and gently pressed it into the damp soil. Nothing happened. The seed remained unseen, the earth remained dark. They placed the pot on the windowsill, right next to the wooden horse. A small, unremarkable clay pot that now held an immeasurable promise. Elara said her goodbyes quietly. Her task was done. The second lesson wasn't the planting. It was the trust that something would grow, even when you couldn't see it yet. It was patience. And then they waited. Chapter 17. The Yellow Miracle. Days passed. Elara visited the Weber family every evening. They would sit together in silent agreement around the small clay pot, which stood unchanged on the windowsill. The earth remained dark. The seed remained silent. With each passing day, a quiet fear grew in Elara that she had failed. Perhaps Mara's tear had not been enough. Perhaps the darkness of Silenda was simply too strong for anything new to grow. But Mara, Leah, and Theo did not lose patience. For them, the pot was more than just soil and a seed. It was a focal point for their rediscovered memory. Mara watered it carefully every morning. Leah wiped the dust from its rim, and little Theo quietly told it stories of his father's dandelion meadow. They weren't just nurturing the seed, they were nurturing hope. On the morning of the 7th day, it was Theo who saw it first. He had woken up early and run to the window to check, as he did every morning. And then he let out a sharp cry of delight. "Mother, Leah, come quick!" Mara and Leah rushed over. And there, in the center of the pot, where Mara's tear had moistened the earth, something had pushed through the dark soil. A tiny, delicate seedling, barely larger than a fingernail, but of such a vibrant, strong green that it looked like a splinter from the gardener's own garden. From that moment on, the miracle happened for all to see. The plant grew with a speed that was not natural. It seemed to draw nourishment not from the pale light of the sky, but from the joy and attention the family gave it. Within a day, it had unfurled 2 strong leaves. On the 2nd day, its stem grew tall and straight, and at its tip, a small, firm bud formed. On the evening of the 2nd day, when Elara came to visit again, the 3 of them were no longer sitting and waiting, but gazing in wonder at the windowsill. The bud was pulsing gently, and from within it, a faint, warm shimmer emanated. "It's going to bloom soon," Leah whispered in awe. For the first time since her father's death, she was holding a drawing pad and a charcoal pencil, trying to capture the gentle curves of the plant. They did not have to wait long. Before their eyes, as if it had only been waiting for the presence of the 4 people who believed in it, the petals slowly began to unfold. They didn't open like a normal flower, but like a small, radiant sun. When it had fully bloomed, a warm, golden light filled the room, as bright and cheerful as the yellow of 1,000 dandelions on a perfect summer day. The light danced on the family's faces. It washed the last gray shadows from Mara's features, revealing a genuine, deep smile on her lips. It reflected in Theo's laughing eyes and made the lines Leah drew on her paper come alive. The light was so strong that it streamed through the window and out into the quiet alley. A warm, golden glow that stood out against the cold, blue light of the gas lamps. A neighbor stopped and looked up in disbelief, then another. Soon a small, silent crowd had gathered in front of the Weber's house. They stared at the window from which the light poured, as if it were a lighthouse in a dark night. Elara stood amidst the happy family and looked out at the faces in the alley. She understood. The blue flower in her room had been her light, a gift she could share. But this new golden yellow flower was Silenda's light. It was the proof. The proof that hope didn't just exist in a hidden mythical place, but that it could be planted, nurtured, and brought to bloom right here in the midst of their darkness by any one of them. Chapter 18. The Constellation of Hope. The golden light that streamed from the Weber family's window became the new talk of the town. It was different from the blue light people had seen at Elara's. The blue light had been a rumor, a distant miracle. But the yellow light was proof. It had grown right here, in their midst, nurtured by the grief and hope of a family everyone knew. It proved that the magic was not bound to a single place or person. It slumbered within them all. The next day, people no longer came just to sit in Elara's room. They came with a new, urgent question. How? How can we plant our own light? Elara knew this was the moment the gardener had prepared her for. She returned one more time to the hidden garden. He was waiting for her with a smile and a small leather pouch. "A gardener passes on his seeds so that new gardens can be created," he said, pressing the pouch into her hand. It was heavy with countless small gray seeds. "Teach them what you have learned. Teach them patience, teach them trust, and teach them to listen to the voice of their own heart." With this blessing, Elara returned and began her true work. Her first stop was Jet, the flower seller. She found her at her stall, arranging her pale asters. Elara handed her a single seed. "The gardener says every seed needs a different feeling. What feeling brought your memory back to you?" Jet thought for a long time, her rough hand stroking a petal. "It wasn't just the memory," she said quietly. "It was gratitude, to be thankful that I once had such beauty." That evening, Jet planted her seed in a small pot amidst her asters, and instead of a tear of sorrow or hope, she watered it with the quiet, deep feeling of gratitude. After a few days, a single, magnificent heather blossom bloomed in the pot. It glowed in a deep, velvety violet, emitting a light as calming as a warm summer evening. Next, Elara sought out Jonas and Leo. She found them by the cliffside stream, building a new fishing rod together, just as they had as boys. She gave them a single seed to share. "Our feeling?" Jonas said, looking at Leo. "I think it was forgiveness." Leo nodded, "and the knowledge that we won't throw it away again." They did not plant the seed in a pot. They placed it in a small crevice of a large moss-covered stone right by the water, at the very spot where their argument had once begun. They watered it not with tears, but with the water from the stream and the warmth of their rekindled friendship. No flower grew there. Instead, the moss on the stone itself began to glow from within, a soft, rich moss green that spread a little further each night, building a bridge of light over the dark places of their past. Finally, Elara went to Silas, the watchmaker. He sat, as always, amidst his ticking clocks. He accepted the seed Elara offered him without surprise. "Each of us has our lost time, my child," he said softly. "Mine had the color of snowflakes in my wife's hair." His tear, which fell onto the soil in a tiny porcelain pot, was not bitter. It was filled with the sweetness of a love that had endured for decades. Amidst the eternal ticking, a delicate, intricate plant grew on his windowsill, its leaves looking like ice crystals. It did not bloom, but it emitted a constant, clear, silver-white light, as pure as starlight. And so, Silenda began to change. Night after night, new lights appeared in the city's windows. A deep red of passion here, a gentle orange of comfort there. Each light was a testament to a healed wound, a rediscovered memory, a renewed connection. Elara often stood at the window of her attic room, looking out. The city was no longer an impenetrable darkness. It had become a dark sky where a constellation of hope was slowly beginning to shine. And she was no longer just the bearer of the light. She was the gardener who gave people the seeds so they could plant their own stars. Chapter 19. The third lesson. A whole month passed. Autumn gently settled over Silenda, but for the first time in living memory, it was not a farewell into darkness. It was a transition, accompanied by the soft, steady lights that now shone in dozens of windows. The city had changed. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with quiet conversations on the streets. People looked each other in the eye again. The gray was still there, but it was broken by countless small, glowing promises. Elara had become the keeper of these promises. She distributed the seeds, listened to the stories, and became a quiet but central point in the new fabric of the city. She felt a deep, calm satisfaction. And yet, she sensed that her training was not yet complete. There was one last unanswered question that gnawed at her heart. On a clear, cool evening, she returned one last time to the garden. The ivy curtain opened for her as if for an old friend. The garden itself seemed to be in a state of peaceful dormancy. Many of the lights shone more softly, more introverted than before. The gardener was sitting on his bench, looking into the luminous foliage. "You see what can become of a single seed," he said as Elara sat down beside him. "It's more than I ever dreamed of," she answered honestly. "But I have a question. Do the lights ever fade? Is the healing they bring only borrowed?" The gardener looked at her with a gentle smile. "A very wise question, and the answer to both is yes." He stood up and led her to one of those silver-white, crystalline plants, like the one that had grown for Silas, the watchmaker. It was beautiful, yet its light was faint. It seemed to be slowly retreating from the tips of the leaves, gathering in the center of the plant like water in a bowl. "Nothing that lives is eternal, Elara, not even the light. But that is no reason for sorrow," the gardener said quietly. "It is the reason for joy." He touched the plant very gently. "This light has fulfilled its purpose. It has brought an old, precious memory back to life. The wound has scarred over, the color has returned. Now that the healing is complete, the light gives back its borrowed strength." Carefully, with the precision of a surgeon, he opened the heart of the plant. There, where the leaves converged, the silver-white glow had condensed into a single tiny point. When the light was fully absorbed, a single small gray seed lay in the center of the now dark, wilting plant. It looked exactly like the one the gardener had once given her. "This is the third and final lesson," the gardener whispered, placing the new seed in Elara's open hand. "To not only carry and plant a light, but to also harvest it." Elara stared at the seed. Suddenly, she understood the entire wondrous cycle. The pain, the tears of hope, the growing of the light, the healing, and finally, the return. The transformation of a healed pain into the possibility of a new healing. "The true art of the gardener is not just to sow," the gardener continued, his voice now quiet and a little tired. "It is to recognize the right moment to let go, to understand that every end is the soil for a new beginning. Only in this way can the garden live on forever." Elara closed her hand around the seed. She no longer felt just the cool, stony promise. She felt the entire journey this little grain had already made. She felt the watchmaker's love, the purity of the memory, and the gentle light that was now ready to embark on a new journey. She was no longer just an apprentice. She was a gardener. She had understood. Chapter 20. The Last Seed. As Elara closed her hand around the new seed, she felt something change in the garden. The gentle humming of the light plants seemed to intensify, swelling into a quiet, reverent melody. The lights of all the flowers, grasses, and mosses turned towards the old gardener, bathing him in a sea of countless colors. He stood in the midst of this luminous ocean, and for the first time, he appeared translucent. His body, which had always seemed so grounded and solid, now seemed to be made of the same soft mist and light as the hidden path to the garden. "My time has come," he said, his voice no more than a whisper in the wind. "My light has fulfilled its purpose. My last memory has been healed." "Which one was that?" Elara asked softly, though she already felt the answer in her heart. A smile as radiant as the yellow dandelion flower appeared on his face. The memory that the garden would not die. The memory that someone would come to carry on the seeds. He looked at her, and in his eyes was all the love and pride of a mentor who sees his student surpass him. "I planted this garden when my own world turned gray. I tended it for all the lost souls who came after me. But a single gardener cannot watch over it forever." Slowly, like a leaf in the autumn wind, his form began to dissolve. His feet became luminous roots that merged with the earth. His hands disintegrated into countless golden particles of dust, which were caught by the gentle breeze and carried throughout the garden. Every particle that touched a plant made its light shine brighter for a moment. "The garden needs a new heart," his voice continued, now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "One that knows the pain of Silenda. One that does not fear the darkness because it knows how to keep a single spark alive." His torso dissolved into a swarm of sky-blue points of light that danced around Elara's head like moths. His face was the last to remain, translucent and peaceful. "Do not be sad, child. This is not an end. This is the harvest." With these words, his smile too dissolved into pure silver-white light that gently sank to the ground, and where he had stood caused a final single flower to bloom. It had the form of a perfect white rose, and its light was so clear and pure that it seemed to unite all the other colors of the garden within it. Elara stood alone in the midst of the garden, which now shone brighter than ever before. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of understanding, of gratitude, and of acceptance. She was no longer Elara, the weaver. She was no longer the girl who had lost a color. She was Elara, the gardener of lost lights. Her task now was to watch over this place, to tend the seeds, to harvest the lights, and to give them to those who found their way. And if the darkness should ever return, she knew she would be there. She would not fight it. She would go out and place the first seed in the hand of another seeker. For she had learned the most important lesson of all. You cannot defeat the darkness, but you can always, always plant a light against it. Epilogue. The years that followed passed over Silenda like the tides, sometimes gentle, sometimes rough, but always constant. The darkness never completely vanished. It had become a part of the city, like the smell of the sea or the echo in the old alleys. But it had lost its oppressive power. For now, there were the lights. They shone in the windows like a constellation of earthly stars, each a testament to a healed wound, a rediscovered color, a mended connection. They were the visible proof that no grief had to last forever and no friendship needed to remain broken. The people of Silenda had learned to tend their own gardens in their hearts. Elara grew older. The young girl who had once lost a color became a woman whose face was etched with the same kind wrinkles as the old gardener's. She watched over the hidden garden, harvested the seeds that grew from healed memories, and gave them to those who found their way to her. She became a quiet legend, the gardener of lost lights, whose story was told by the fireside on cold evenings. One late afternoon, as the sun painted the sky in soft shades of orange and violet, Elara sat on the old wooden bench in the midst of the garden. Leah Weber, now a young artist, sat beside her, capturing the glowing white rose that never seemed to wilt in her sketchbook. Little Theo, now a lively boy, chased the golden particles of dust that rose from the grasses. Then they heard footsteps on the misty path. A small, frightened girl with eyes as gray as a rainy sky stepped into the garden. She held the broken pieces of a porcelain teacup in her hands. The child whispered, "My grandmother loved it. It was the color of forget-me-nots. I can't remember anymore." Elara smiled. It was the same smile the old gardener had once given her, full of warmth, understanding, and infinite patience. She stood up, gently took the girl's hand, and led her to a patch of soil where there was still an empty space. "Don't worry, my child," she said, and her voice was like the rustling of dry leaves in an autumn wind. "No color is ever lost forever. Sometimes it is only sleeping. Let's see if we can wake it up together." And so the cycle began anew, a seed, a tear, a memory, a light.